On behalf of our phenomenal steering committee, I'd like to welcome everybody to WiLing Wednesday live webinar series. We're wrapping up our series on Hodgkin lymphoma today with a very special career reflections session focusing on two leaders and role models in the field, Drs. Jane Winter and Ranjana Advani, who will be interviewed by two emerging stars in the field, Drs. Pamela Allen and Jennifer Crombie. For those of you who are not familiar with Women in Lymphoma, we are an international group committed to supporting and advocating for greater leadership of women in lymphoma globally through advocacy, networking, and education. We currently have now more than 310 members. We are grateful for the support of the Snow Dome Foundation and for Anna Steiner. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, MSD and Roche, for their support of our education in lymphoma. So our first duo, it will be Dr. Jane Winter and Dr. Pamela Allen. Dr. Winter is professor of medicine in the Division of Hematology Oncology at Northwestern University. She earned her medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania. She is the ASH President-elect 2021 and served as Vice President this past year. She's been active in ASH for many years as a member of the Executive Committee and on the Committee for Educational Affairs. She was awarded the Paula H. Stern Award for Outstanding Women in Medicine and Science from Northwestern Women Faculty Association in September of 2020. She's a member of the Lymphoma Steering Committee at the National Cancer Institute. Her research interests include clinical and biologic markers of prognosis in diffuse large B-cell lymphoma and clinical trials, as well as translational research with novel agents in Hodgkin and non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And she is going to be interviewed by Dr. Pamela Blair Allen from the Winship Cancer Institute at Emory University in Atlanta, and was previously a mentee, an ongoing mentee of Dr. Winters. So welcome and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. And I just want to start by saying this is a huge honor for me to be able to interview Dr. Winter. She and I met almost 6.5 years ago when I started my fellowship at Northwestern. She was the very first person I met. I started my first rotation on the inpatient service, and she also happened to be my outpatient attending at the same time. And we have continued to collaborate ongoing since my fellowship and into my junior faculty. She was a big part of the reason that I went into academic medicine. And she's a huge inspiration and role model. And I think it's a rare opportunity, I think, as a mentee that you actually get to, in this kind of a format, ask questions. So thank you for the opportunity. And thank you, Jane, for letting me ask you some questions today. So I wanted to first just ask, I first wanted to ask you a little bit, kind of going back in your history. Can you tell us a little bit about your career path and what ultimately led you to go into academics and specifically into lymphoma?
Well, in terms of, everyone always asks why you went into medicine too. And I think I had the experience of having a husband-wife team as my pediatricians, which I think you know. And that was sort of something that I just assumed sounded like a great deal. They would swap being, one would make house calls, the other would be in the office, and the kids would play in the backyard. The office was the first floor of their home. So it always seemed to me sort of something that would be very comfortable. And then when I was a little bit older, maybe 10 or 11, I read a series called Cherry Ames, and I thought I wanted to be a nurse. And I told my mom that, and she said, well, why don't you be a doctor instead of being a nurse? And I said, well, that's fine, okay, I'll be a doctor. And I just sort of embraced it. It wasn't that I had this great affinity to science, which everyone always, sort of, oh, I worked in a lab or whatever in high school or whatever. That wasn't the case. And in fact, at one time I thought I was going to be an anthropologist. So when I went off to college, I went to a women's college, which I think is important. And that was sort of not intentional, but sort of happened. And there I met lots of other like-minded women who were all interested in going into medicine, so it didn't seem an oddity. And then I went to medical school at Penn, and it's of interest. There was a women's organization there that keeps a record of every woman who ever went there. And first woman was in 1918, although the medical school existed since 1760s or so. And if you look, the numbers of women were in the single digits for the first, until just about a few years before me. So of 150 or 60, there would be 3 or 4, and that's from beginning in 1918. And then suddenly in the 70s, there were a few more, there were 15. And then there were, 17. And then my class, all of a sudden, there were 34 of us, which made for a comfortable group of women who, who made it very comfortable. The rest of the institution wasn't so comfortable with us, but we were comfortable with one another. And in terms of going into hematology, oncology, I think things are serendipitous. You have a good experience with, or a good relationship with someone. And I had some good experiences with particular rotations in hematology. I spent a month at Fox Chase with a friend. So I was had good experiences. But also as a medical student, so relevant to this, to women in lymphoma, a childhood friend of mine who lived with me while I was in medical school, she was going to Wharton and I was going to medical school. And she developed Hodgkin's lymphoma while I was a third-year student. And, I was sort of making the diagnosis and so on. And then she was treated while lived in the house with us and was getting her therapy. So I think if I look back, that had to have been, she was a close family friend, as well as her parents were my parents' good friends, and so on and so forth. So that was important. And I think if I look back today, that's probably one of the reasons, as well as experiences I had as a house officer, John Altman, who influenced me. And made lymphoma interesting, exciting. I loved looking under the microscope. I liked reading Heme Path. That was an important piece of it. So it all sort of evolved over time. But I think it's very serendipitous. You have a good experience and bright people, I think, will go, I could have been a nephrologist, I suspect, had I had a good experience with a nephrologist. So I think it's hard to say exactly what, but some of those experiences were clearly formative.
It sounds like you had a lot of positive female role models, early on, from your mother to your pediatrician to to the experiences that you had in medical school. At what point did you start feeling like you were different, or did you at all come into any difficulty feeling like you were one of the few or one of the only women?
Well, I came from a medical school class of 34 of us, but then I went off to residency and I was one of 2. So there were only 2 of us, 2 women in my internship group. And, as it turned out, we both went into hematology along with the men who were also members of our internship group. We married. There was one big engagement party for the 4 of us, given by the division chief, Harvey Gollum. And so it was a little isolating, and it was very isolating as a junior faculty member. So there just weren't other women. there were no other women in our division. Jamie Van Roen was recruited after while I was there. But across other, so my hematopathologists have always been my rock. So I worked recently, the hematopathologist who I worked with for my entire career passed away from COVID at age 90. She was reading pathology till she was 84. So she was, she was a Rappaport trained pathologist who was the pathologist on every one of my projects, read 360 cases of large cell lymphoma for my first project, the US in a group proliferative activity study. And the next one, she read another, 300 cases and so on. So, but I always found my hematopathologist to be, and some of my radiologists, my nuclear medicine folks, because I've done a fair amount with them. So I think those relationships, you have to reach out when you're alone. You have to find your friends elsewhere.
And kind of along that same line, especially for some of the more junior investigators, what kind of challenges did you face early on in your career? And what kind of things did you do to overcome those? And what kind of advice would you give to people that are kind of starting out?
Well, I think you need to, oftentimes you don't know what kinds of things to do. How do you go about, and so it is important to find individuals, and they need not necessarily be women always. I mean, there weren't women around, so my husband has always been a good mentor for me, or someone I could model myself and see how he and others, what kinds of things they pursued, how you go about doing things. And I think it's very difficult. And particularly now, I think at least in the US, it's very difficult for junior faculty because the clinical burdens are so onerous. And I have to say that I was very fortunate that in the early days, the clinical demands were significantly less. And so it was possible to carve out time in your day, or, if your evenings, your weekends, if you can find some time there to do your academic work. But now we're all burdened by the electronic medical record. And every one of us, spends a huge amount of time that previously I would have spent, doing my academic work, my, writing papers, clinical trials, etc. So I think everyone's really squeezed, and I think it's overflowed into home life, and it's difficult. So I think that's a big challenge. I mean, for me, finding, there's a lot of navigation of politics, and which I think is always a challenge.
And did you, one thing I've always admired about you, and maybe it comes with, being more senior and having experience, is that sense of being able to kind of assert yourself in any room, in any kind of situation. Did it take you a while to find that voice, or were you always somebody that was able to kind of, stand up for yourself, or kind of assert yourself? In
the CEO and so on. I think a lot of that does come with a fair amount comes with experience and time. And I have to say that I certainly don't remember that I perhaps had those skills early on. But it also, I think you learn that, if you don't if you're not your own cheerleader, no one else will be. And, you know, as you know from some of our collaborations, I mean, there are times when I am just like, you know, I'm holding the phone there and I can't believe you're saying that. I can hold the phone like this for another 10 minutes while someone rants. And, you know, I said, like, I would never do that, but I'm holding the phone and I'm hearing you say that, you know, and I think, you know, like why they should be the first author on the paper sort of conversation. And I think it comes with time, but and it comes with experience. So I think you need to be your own champion. And, you know, we all have a hard time with that. Because I think it doesn't come, you know, and maybe I think maybe in your generation, I am so impressed with you and with so many of your cohort in terms of your self-confidence, how you know what you want a mentor. I mean, things that I didn't know to ask for. So I think I've probably told you this, I had a career development award. And the person who was first of all, when I was told, well, you can apply for this. And they said, here's the example of somebody who was successful. It was a nephrologist. Just write it like this, you know. When I got the grant, and my mentor met with me twice in the 3 years to sign the paperwork. And that was it. There was nothing, you know, nothing else that came with the mentorship, but the signature. So, you know, your group, your cohort knows to ask, you know, says, well, you know, when people come to interview for fellowship, they want to know about mentorship. And I think that's to know what you want. And if you don't find it in one place, that you go someplace else.
Yeah, and you've talked to me, I've heard you talk about that before, that in the sense of mentorship, that you had to get a little bit creative. It sounded like early in your career because you didn't have really a defined mentor. Do you think that has impacted how you've been a mentor to, you know, to people moving forward? Or how do you think that has affected your interactions with, you know, medical students and residents and fellows and junior faculty moving forward?
I clearly recognize that, you know, the absence thereof for me, you know, I had oftentimes what I considered to be anti-mentors, you know, people who sort of were, you know, superficially you'd think they were my mentors, but they really weren't. And I think that it makes me recognize that people need mentorship, but for me, it's what's most fun too. So, you know, sort of working on a protocol with you and getting, you know, figuring out how we should do it and so on, that was fun. And if I were to do it on my own, that wasn't fun. So, you know, I think that, you know, it's the same way as looking at pathology with my pathologist, with the hematopathologist. It's much more fun when we do it together. So for me, maybe it's a little selfish that I enjoy what I'm doing much more when it's involving someone else. But mentorship comes in all different shapes and forms. So, you know, and you don't have to, it doesn't have to be the person right there. It's more fun and helpful when it is, but sometimes you have to reach out and, for me, it would be someone across the country, someone I was only really seeing at meetings, perhaps.
And I wanted to ask a little bit about now being ASH president and what that experience has been like for you.
So first of all, I do want to make
president-elect.
Yeah, I want to make one point, and that is, you know, you have to seize every opportunity. So sometimes we're all too busy and an opportunity presents itself, but you choose to do something else because you're too busy. And so, you know, I can go back to my involvement in ASH. Conti Rai came to give a named lecture. And we were all asked who wanted to meet with Conti. And I signed up. I think I had met him previously at meetings and so on, but I signed up and I had just had a paper that was accepted in Blood and so on. And we had this great talk where I was showing him all my data and so on. And, 2 weeks later, I get a call from Andy Schaefer. Would I like to be the education co-chair for his year for the annual meeting at ASH? Now, had I sort of said, oh, I'm too busy, I've got, I don't have time to meet with Conti Rai. I mean, that was an opportunity, but I see this happen all the time where someone is coming who is a visitor and people don't, and they're offered the opportunity and they don't seize the opportunity. And so that was the beginning of my involvement in ASH. And, for me, it's a group. I have my friends also through ECOG and other things, but I have my friends around the world now because, people I've traveled with, I've spent time with for 15 years. And I've made such incredible friends, and many of them women. Nancy Berliner, lots of fabulous women who make it so much more fun, and who also mentor me in a way where I can see things about how they think and what they do, and so we're always learning and we're always sort of changing.
I wanted to backtrack just for a second, just to comment on a question that had come in, or on a comment that had come in about how there's oftentimes these senior males that are still, as first author. And I just want to make a comment about, our relationship, because the trial that we had talked about, you let me, present that at ASH, and at in Cologne, and then in Cologne, and then when we wrote the Blood manuscript that just came out, I was the first author on that, and that was a protocol that I wrote during fellowship, and and it came out when I was junior faculty, and that certainly was such a wonderful experience for me, but yeah, that does not always happen. For sure. And I wanted to talk a little bit about just raising a family, particularly in your early years, when you had, very young children, and how you managed that, and especially the culture was different back then, and how you were able to navigate that.
Well, I think that to some extent, I don't have any family. We have no family in the Chicago area. So that was a little bit, compared to situations where we would have had more support. But our friends became our family. So who were also raising young children, and that became our support. You need to go to the ER in the middle of the night. One kid goes down the block to the other, and you're the best example in terms of how you do that. I mean, so I think we were very fortunate in those days to have, I had two sort of babysitter housekeepers for my children over 30 years. Our first woman was both grandmothers, older women, who helped to raise my children, the first for the first 8 years, and the second until she passed away over 20 years. I mean, my sons were taking her out for lunch, in their late 20s, and she continued to work for us until she passed away. And I was very fortunate to have them. Very kind, loving women who had many children and grandchildren of their own. So I think they.
Now that your kids are grown, so you have kind of the benefit of retrospect. How did what do they say about that experience growing up? And is there anything that you wish you would have done more or less of, or anything that you thought that you were worried about at the time that ended up not actually being as big of a deal as you thought?
I think a lot depends upon the culture in which, and that's why, it'd be so interesting to have a big conversation about internationally, because I think the cultures are different. And so we are very fortunate in that we live virtually on the campus of the University of Chicago. And when I needed to find who was going to be home for an emergency, there was no woman on the block there was no one who wasn't, in her office at the university, or so lots of people were in a similar situation. And for my sons, most of their friends were in similar situations. So they had moms. Some of the moms had, if you're a psychology professor on campus, you have a lot more flexibility. You can walk from your lab to the lab school or whatever. But, so I think it's a little bit different when my nurse practitioner lives in the suburbs, and for her, there's a big difference between some of the other moms and her. People who don't work, don't have careers, and so on. So I was fortunate, and my younger son, who's now engaged, he had a friend, one of his fiance's friends, who decided to stop work as soon as she was married. And he was like, he was just like, what is this, Mom? I don't understand this, because he doesn't, he just can't comprehend that. So I think both of my sons are, I think they appreciate having had a career, and I think it was better for them. I mean, the one thing that they missed, my younger son will say, is a dog. So he blames me that we never had a dog. I said, you're 32 years old, have a dog. Get the dog. My older son has a dog. But I think that's what they miss. They miss the dog. But otherwise, I tried hard to be there. I drove to soccer games, to Wisconsin, nearly to Wisconsin, and so on and so forth. So,
and I remember one of the things you told me at one point was take pictures, make sure that you get us there. Yes, yes. So one last question that I wanted to ask. So what do you find most meaningful, or that brings you the most joy in your career now? And is that different than when you first started?
I think I know more what I like than I did early on. So, and it's not just one thing. So I think we're so fortunate as academic physicians in that we have a mixture, that we're not, we're not only seeing patients, we're not only doing like administrative work or whatever. So it's the mixture. But it's my three, I love my patients, and especially since I've been in the same place for 30 years, some of them, fortunately, I have my survivors who come back to see me, and I know their families, they remember me being pregnant. I mean, that's sometimes, can you believe that? That's amazing to me. And I love working with the house staff. I don't have much exposure to medical students, because it's only on the rare occasion that we have medical students come to clinic or come on service. And I love working similarly with the fellows. And I like my projects, and I like my ASH family. And so I like all of those things, and not a single, one alone would not be sufficient to sustain me. I like the mixture. So, and it's been a pleasure working with you, Pam, and watching you grow, and Pam is just a quick study. She is terrific. So it's been a pleasure. And when I find someone, so it's hard to always find a mentee whom it will be as satisfying to mentor. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that we're on the half hour for our time. So this was a lot of fun, and I hope that everyone else enjoyed, and learned from you as well in listening to this.
And I learned from you all the time.
Yeah, thank you both so much for such a personal and honest discussion. And we'll move on to our next duo, and then at the end we may have a few minutes for some questions if people want to put anything into the chat that you'd like to hear about. So our next pair, I'd love to introduce Dr. Ranjana Advani, who is a professor of medicine at Stanford. She holds the Saul Rosenberg Endowed Professorship. She oversees the treatment of nearly all of the lymphoma patients at Stanford Cancer Institute. She is the group leader for lymphoma and does her primary research interests include non-Hodgkin and Hodgkin lymphoma, looking at optimizing frontline regimens, as well as developing novel agents and looking for therapies in the relapse and refractory setting, and looking at biomarkers. She leads many multi-institutional efforts as a national study primary investigator, is an amazing accruer to studies, and is a leader in those. She's published extensively in the peer-reviewed literature. She is a member of the ECOG Lymphoma Core Committee, the NCCN Guideline Committee for non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and she's the vice chair for Hodgkin Lymphoma Panel. And she also served as the co-chair of the NCI, the National Cancer Institute Lymphoma Steering Committee. She is going to be interviewed by Dr. Jennifer Crombie from Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, who is a rising star, and we really look forward to hearing the two of you.
Thank you, Anne. I'll also start just by thanking Women in Lymphoma for this opportunity. You just heard from Anne about Ranjana's impressive academic career and her many leadership positions. And so as someone who's early on, when I think about someone whose career I want to emulate, you're at the top of the list of someone who I hope to be like. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to chat with you this evening here, I guess in the morning and elsewhere. Like the first part of the session, just sort of go through a series of questions so we can learn more about your path, your academic path, and then a little bit more about you and how you've kind of juggled an impressive career with your home life. And so, and most importantly, I want to just get your advice on a variety of things that hopefully will be helpful to the people who are tuning in. So I will kind of start by also going back to the beginning with the sort of generic question of what was it that brought you or led you to the field of medicine? When did you know you wanted to be a physician? And more specifically, what drew you to lymphoma?
So thanks, Jennifer, and thanks for organizing this, and Anne for having me being one of the people you interview. I wanted to say Jane has been a wonderful mentor to me, so it was really lovely to hear her go and learn more about her path as to how she got here. So Jennifer, I grew up in India, and I had my grandmother was a physician. And the culturally over there, you're a joint family. You live at, everybody lives in the same house. So my mother told me that as far as she could remember, I've never said I wanted to be a teacher or a nurse or something. I always said I wanted to be a physician. And I think it's because I have this wonderful role model of a grandmother who was at home. She graduated from medical school in 1929 in an era where very, very few women went into medicine. And she was a bit, I think in this day and age, she'd be a family practice doctor, but in her times it was called Women in Health. So she did pediatrics and she did gynecology, and she had a little black bag, and she was a country doc. I mean, she made $100, and I used to find it fascinating. So, and I used to spend many, many, many hours growing up with her. So I think that was my first introduction to that, the women don't have to just be housewives, and they can be in the professional world. And I had my dad's sister who was also a scientist, and she was a physicist. So I had two very successful female role models at home growing up. And that kind of was my first thing about, no, I want to do medicine. I really enjoy what grandma does and watching her and her life and, what she means to people and what the difference she makes in people's lives. So that's kind of how it started off. And then just as I was about to apply to med school, my mother's mother got diagnosed with chronic myeloid leukemia. And of course, those were pre-days where we didn't really have anything. And to the T, 5 years later, she passed away with blast crisis, just as I was entering medical school. So that sort of got me thinking about heme malignancies as a whole because of the personal experience. And then when I was in the final year of medical school myself, I suddenly felt a node on the left side of my neck. And of course, when you work in India and you work in the medical schools in India, the better ones are the public hospitals. So you're exposed to a lot of infectious diseases. And I remember seeing this node, which was golf ball size, and going to my division chief, and he says, oh, we're going to give you 9 months of tuberculosis treatment because that's 99%, that's what it's going to be. And that's what most people would have done. And I don't know what it was. I'm not taking TB treatment for 9 months till I know what it is. So we landed at biopsy, and then it was Hodgkin's. And so that sort of, sealed sort of my journey for the rest of my life, because this was way back when, and I was very lucky. It was very early stage, it was caught, but it was at a time when we did staging laparotomies and we did lymphangiograms, and CT scans had just sort of, come into the picture, and this was India. But even way back then, after, when I had the diagnosis, my father kind of was a little unsettled about, he wanted to make sure his daughter got the best treatment. And through the connections and everything, he'd heard about Stanford University and that there was a Henry Kaplan over there who had pioneered radiotherapy, and there was somebody called Saul Rosenberg there. So next thing I knew was my sister and I were on a plane, which was this was 30 years ago. It was a long journey to just sort of come to be seen and not knowing anyone here. And I saw them. They reassured me that, I'd be fine, that mantle radiation would be the way to go. And I went back and felt very reassured and had the privilege of sort of meeting Ron Dorfman, who was a pathology giant, and reviewing science. Anyway, so that's kind of how I decided in my final year of med school, when I got diagnosed with Hodgkin's, that okay, this is it. This is what I want to do. I want to give back. I was very fortunate to have been caught early and, probably cured. And I was going to train in medicine and then do a fellowship in hematology and, do what it takes to train in lymphoma. So that's kind of how I got interested in choosing that as a career path.
Wow. That is an incredible personal kind of connection to medicine from when you were young, and then more personally with your own experience. I'm sure that shapes your kind of own approach to your patients, having been in that situation. And it's kind of amazing to also see it come full circle, and that you now have the Saul Rosenberg chair at Stanford, and that he met him then. So once you made the decision to pursue lymphoma, and it sounds like an academic career, we heard this in the first part of the talk with Jane about her experience with mentors or anti-mentors. Were you in a similar situation? What kind of mentorship did you have throughout your training, and who were your mentors, and did you find that these people shaped you in your career that you ultimately pursued, or was it more similar to what we heard earlier, where you were kind of figuring things out and on your own?
You know, at different times of your training, it's different situations, but I had two amazing mentors. They were male and they were both giants in the field. So when I joined Stanford, it was, you know, how I got to Stanford is another whole story, and I'm not going to really go into that. But it's when I finally joined the fellowship, you know, I was hired into the hematology part of the fellowship. At Stanford, heme and onc are separate, and lymphoma is under oncology, which I had no idea when I joined the fellowship way back when. So I actually joined hematology, and my mentor was Stan Schreier. Now, you're young enough that you all might not know him, but Stan was a giant in the field of hematology. And the other mentor I had was Saul Rosenberg, and he still is a mentor to me, and Stan passed away last year. But both Stan and Saul were mentors who, one, who were international, had seen the world and were familiar with, you know, people who've trained in different countries, and that you can have clinical excellence and knowledge base even if you've trained somewhere else. They also were very family oriented, and I found that they appreciated the sort of the challenges you face as a woman. And they, in fact, are the ones who guided me along the way. And I'll give you two specific examples. So one, of course, they made sure that they gave me a lot of opportunities. Stan, I started out with Stan. He gave me a lot of opportunities. I worked in his lab. I was a fellow. We had 2 papers in blood. I learned a lot of amazing things on hemoglobinopathy, but my heart was not in it. I wanted to do lymphoma. And when I told him that I wanted to switch to, I wanted to do oncology and not stay on in hematology, even though we had a program project grant and I had very good funding with him. And his initial reaction to me was, "You want to read recipes from a cookbook and give chemotherapy?" I said, "No, I want to learn lymphoma." And so, but through this humor of his, my husband at that point worked at Hewlett Packard, and he had a career opportunity to go work in Germany in a very senior position. And our eldest child was about a few months old when this opportunity arose, and it meant pushing back my oncology part of the fellowship by 3 years. And I was very, very torn, because it was like, I didn't want to lose out because, you've sort of stayed home for 3 years or whatever. So I went to Stan, and he just looked at me and he says, "The family stays together. Don't ever make that mistake. And, you're young, 3 years in your lifetime is not going to matter. You're going to go to Germany." So, it just took hearing that from somebody who I respected and who was so well known and established that it was okay to prioritize, family at that point in my life. And that's what I did. And then I remember when I moved back and I started my oncology fellowship and I was working with Saul, when you're a fellow and you're on wards and you go on rounds, Saul was my attending. And on one particular week, it's like the last minute, the babysitter doesn't show up and you have your husband's not in town and you have nowhere to leave this 5-year-old. So I just said, okay, you know what, I'm going to take her with me. So I was petrified. I didn't know what he'd say. So I took her with me, and in the nursing room, in the nurse's station, got her crayons, and the nurses are your friends at that point. And they said, "We'll watch her, don't worry." And I didn't know how Saul would react. And to my surprise, when we were done with rounds, he held Anjali's hand and he said, "We're going to go to the cafeteria and we're going to have ice cream together and have a hot dog together." And for the next 2 hours, he entertained this daughter of mine. And he came and he said, "Life is about balance, and I have my kids and I want grandkids, and this is what we need to prioritize." So while I had these they were amazing mentors in how to balance life for me. I had to seek some academic mentorship outside because I didn't, when you work at a very well-known lymphoma center, it's hard to sort of find a footing and find a niche as to where you're going to land and how to sort of separate yourself as a separate entity from the giants who are already over there. And so friends internationally were very helpful, people who I got to know in conferences. I gave you the example of Jane, and I remember spending hours chatting with Jane over, I don't know how many Lugano meetings where we would have dinner and, we just talk, and she'd mentor, just chat. Recently, because my background has been clinical and how do you develop contributing to the basic science part of it, Margaret Shipp has been a very good mentor in that. So you find collaborations outside to kind of find yourself and understand yourself better, which then you can sort of say, okay, I think now I know how I kind of want to develop or what I need to do next.
I loved that story about you staying with your family and making the choice to go to Germany. I feel like often we feel like we have to hit all of the milestones at the exact same time as the people around us, or maybe peers who may not have the same family situation, but clearly it all worked out for you in your academic path, and you did kind of choose to prioritize your family and could catch up when the time was right. So I like that example.
The other thing is, we set artificial timelines for ourselves. Okay, you enter academia and, you're surrounded by, okay, you have to have a grant and you have to be, if you're not from assistant to associate professor at the first mark, you're a failure. And if you don't, make it to full professor, you're a failure. So we have all these, sort of, somebody has defined all that, right? But success or failure shouldn't be determined by these external sort of timelines and guidelines. And, looking back, I think, okay, so fine. I mean, I stayed as an instructor for 7 years because Stanford wouldn't allow me to work part-time initially. And I had 3 very young kids, and my husband traveled all the time on his job. So you need one parent at home and not be on call and things. So I wanted to work 75%. And Stanford just didn't have a way to let me be, a faculty member, but sort of share my time or do anything. So I had to stay on as an instructor till I was ready to join full time. And that's when I got the title of assistant professor. And I was like mortified that, I'll be, I don't know, 100 years old and still be an assistant professor or something. But it falls into place. And somehow it was a very productive 7 years. I wrote a lot. So when the time came from assistant to associate, it happened early. It happened in 3 years instead of 5. And then the next clock from associate to full professor, which usually takes 10 years or 7 to 10 years at Stanford, happened in 3 years. So it's almost like you make up for the lost time. And at the end of the day, it didn't matter. So I tell fellows who ask me now, especially the female fellows who are young and they have the children, it's like, you have to sort of balance and succeed even on your personal life front, because otherwise you won't succeed in your career.
That's really good advice. Getting back to the mentorship a little bit more, you mentioned some examples internally, some external collaborators that you've worked with. Some people listening in may be just embarking on that process and looking for the right mentor. What advice would you say to actually find the person that they want to work with, and how should they best foster the relationship once they may start working with somebody?
Well, it's the easiest if your mentor is in your own institution because you're there, and I think it's easy if you have a senior mentor because they're already well established, and I mean, yeah, some of them like to have the limelight all the time, but very often senior mentors will let you be the first author, like Jane, let you run the trial and grow with it, and because they're not threatened by you. And if you have somebody who's very, very junior, sometimes you're in competition with them. So that's what I've learned, that it was better to find a mentor who's mid-career or senior, that they promote your growing. But I do think it's, mentorship has many facets to it. One is, of course, the academic work, but then the other parts of, other opportunities and challenges which come by meeting people on different committees or serving on different, scientific advisory boards or something. And you never know how the opportunity presents itself. But I do think it's important to have a local mentor at the institution you're in, and talk to many people in whatever you're interested in, and see who you sort of who gives you time. I mean, Jane said somebody saw her like twice in the 3-year grant period. that's very difficult. You can't have that situation. And you kind of know, like if you set up a time to meet with one of your mentor who you would like to meet, if that person tells you, I'm busy, or keeps delaying or canceling appointments on you, that person's not going to be a mentor. So, find somebody who's willing to give you the time and opportunities.
And then just getting back into some of the other kind of roles that you've had and other leadership positions. We heard from Anne when she was going through your kind of academic portfolio that you've done a lot of different, you've been a part of a lot of different organizations, both within Stanford and then nationally. So I was hoping you could kind of share with us some of your kind of favorite leadership roles that you've participated in. And, there may be people listening who want to similarly be involved in these organizations or hope to one day have similar roles. How did you get involved in order to get these positions? And what did you like about these parts of your job?
Mm-hmm. So, so I have to mention another mentor who is no longer at Stanford, but she was an amazing lymphoma physician. Her name is Sandra Horning, and she was the chair of the ECOG lymphoma committee when I was junior faculty, and I guess you can have, because she was the chair, her position in the committee didn't count as representation from Stanford, and there was a slot open. So she's the one who encouraged me that, no, it's a good thing to do when you'll meet people. And actually, I think that's where I first met Jane, is through ECOG. But that kind of opened the door for meeting other people, seeing what trials might be available, how a corporate group thinks about trials, and how you can get some early writing projects from studies nobody wanted to ever finish or write up. So that it was an opening door. And I think the role which I've enjoyed a lot is being the vice chair of the NCCN Hodgkin's panel with my colleague Rich Hoppy, who's the chair. He's from Stanford too. And not only is he an amazing person to work with and an amazing mentor also, but it's just that it's very collegial, and it's trying to, it teaches you the skill of trying to understand the literature and get see how the rest of the academic institutions think about a certain problem, and vote on it, and to make sure you're representing the literature in a fair way, but not putting too many of your personal biases into it. So you grow in that too. But that's a committee I've particularly enjoyed, and working with them quite a lot. And again, NCCN is something, when you're a junior faculty, if your institution is a member of the NCCN and they don't have representation of the lymphoma or the Hodgkin's panel, you can get, talk to whoever is there to get you appointed. But I think as a starting point, that one of the cooperative groups trying to get onto their committee, or at least starting to go for their meetings, is quite useful, so that you learn the process of how senior people in the field think about trial design and what to do.
And it sounds just, by participating in these projects, by taking care of patients, by running clinical trials, you wear many different hats in your job. I find a lot of people struggle with figuring out how to balance all of those different tasks. What have you found as your kind of key to success when it comes to doing so many different things? And I think anyone who does clinical research and takes care of patients probably feels this way, that it's hard to manage all of the different roles. But how have you found success in this?
Yeah, it's it's funny, because sometimes you look at organizations which are bigger, I see MD Anderson or something. I mean, they're huge in lymphoma, and they have somebody doing T cell, and somebody doing large cell, and someone doing mantle cell, and subspecialties within a subspecialty, and they can recruit thousands of patients. And then I look at our program, it's this tiny little program where I see, I think, about 60-70% of the volume, and I have colleagues who see the rest. And I think God, wouldn't it be better if we were bigger and we could like, more? And then I think, no, the reason I have the finger in so many pies is because we're so small, and you can almost participate in everything, and your clinic feeds into all these trials. You have to enjoy what you're doing and to prioritize that to sort of keep at it. So I enjoy phase 1 trials a lot, and when it's a new drug with good science behind it. And I still remember the early days of the ibrutinib story when we had first started doing that trial, and the first patient of mantle cell who went on, was like, it was hospice or a trial, and like 2 weeks later she was walking around. So there's small joys in clinical medicine which come from sort of doing this kind of work, which keeps you going. And then you just and so long as you're learning in the process, I think that's what keeps me going. That everything I do, whether it's collaborations have been with Margaret, or collaborations with the the Lunenburg group for biomarkers, or the clinical stuff, or stuff I do with NCC and ECOG, I'm learning every single day too. So that keeps you very awake and motivated and challenged, and no one patient is the same. I mean, we know that from medicine, that every person is different and every case is different. And I find that fascinating.
Me too. We only have a few minutes left, so I wanted to, I know you alluded to having 3 young children and about having mentors who supported your, need for balance and kind of prioritize that. But, having now gone through the early part of your career and raising 3 children, what advice, has there been anything that you would suggest for people you're seeing now who may be in that position with young kids, about how to kind of make that work, or things that were you found?
You have to be engaged in the kids' lives. You can't sort of do this excluding them. So the way I tried to be part of their lives was this was, remember when we were all in early days in our training, the cell phones didn't exist. It was, they had to page. My kids knew how to page me and could page me. and sometimes it was, and the understanding was that they could call me, and if I couldn't talk, I would tell them that. But what I found was they would reach out to me. It was like, they're coming home from school. And it was, Mom, I got an A in math. And they just needed that 5-second, like to share that. And if you're not available with them to share that moment is lost. So it was like, be accessible, but draw the boundary and say that, okay, if I can speak to you, I will. If I can't, I can't. And I find that they respect that, and you're engaged. And, my husband was very supportive of what I do and facilitated that I could, stay as an instructor for 7 years. But I remember one year he was the cookie chair for Girl Scouts because I didn't have the time, and he took over that, and we had a garage full of Girl Scout cookies, which he coordinated. And again, because the girls wanted to, do that. So I think you just, whether you have parents helping you or your spouse helping you, but you sort of make it work. And for everybody, the balance is different. But I think my biggest advice is don't exclude yourself from the activities of your kids' lives. It's important to be part of it.
That's very good advice. So we only have like 2 minutes left. So I wonder if now is a good time to see if anyone had any questions for either Ranjana or Jane, who is still here. Kind of see if anyone else has questions.
Can
So
I
I'd like
ask
to
a
just
question?
Oh, sure. Do you mind, Judith, if I read Dr. Michael Crump's comment? I'd love to
Please
read
do.
this.
Yeah.
So yes, so Dr. Crump from Toronto writes, I've always considered Ranjana to be a courageous and determined person. That disclosure of her own experience with lymphoma solidified that impression tonight. Thank you for sharing this very personal part of your journey to being a leader in your field. So thank you. And Judith, please.
Thanks, Michael.
Oh, I totally agree with Michael's sentiments, and I want to thank you both for being so open and sharing those, that personal experience. I think that's, signifies great leadership and bravery. I guess I'm going to dig a little bit deeper and ask you both, perhaps you first, Ranjana, following on from your comment about your children. How do you deal with the guilt, you know, as a parent? You know, I wish I'd dumped the guilt years ago, but it takes a long time to dump the guilt. And I don't know when one ever does. How do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, look, there are days where you feel horribly guilty because you've missed major events, and there are days where you balance it, you sort of make it up to them in other ways. And I've tried really hard not to feel guilty, but it's not, I mean, it's human nature. Guilt does you do to come into it, but I feel that I have been there for them when they've needed me the most, at least made myself available to them. And and sort of guided them in the background. And I feel that more than that, you can be a role model to them, that they're women. My two older children are girls. And then the son is the youngest, that you can have working mothers who have to balance lives. So in fact, one of them told me, I don't remember, Mom, you're not like the other moms who used to hang out in school all the time and knew all the teachers. It's like, you don't know anybody. And in fact, when their friends would come over, they said, Mom, you've met them before. This is so-and-so. Don't by asking their name again. So I think kids help you not feel guilty by sort of covering for your lapses.
I think they absolve you of the guilt, don't they, when they say how wonderful you are. Jane, what's your trick?
Oh, I think it's a huge relief. So both of us have children now who are left the nest, and they seem to have done okay. They're successful people, grown-ups. So it sort of validates my sense that they see you happy, you fulfilled, they understand that a career is more than a job. And they, one of my sons is a corporate lawyer, and he'll sometimes like dismiss his work. He'll say, well, it's, you know, I'm not saving lives or whatever. Wonders about the value sometimes of what he does. But I think it's also having the right community. So I think it is harder if the rest of the community is one where the moms are home all the time. So I think that makes a difference, and that makes it harder.
Thank you both.
Well, I'd like to thank Jane and Ranjana, Jennifer, and Pam for just a phenomenal hour. It was just amazing to hear your insights. You are, you know, role models and inspiration to all of us. And thank you again.
Thank you. This was fun. So much fun.
Thank you. This was very enjoyable.
Enjoyed all the experience listening to Ranjana. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Ditto. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just shout out to our next series. We're going to be talking about T-cell lymphoma. Julie Vos is going to be organizing this. We start early April. We'd also like to thank our sponsors again, and to the steering committee for women in lymphoma. So thanks again for joining, and we'll see you soon.
And can I just thank you, Anne, for a tremendous series. And it was so beautifully streamlined, and you've raised the bar very high for Julie and T-cell lymphoma and all the career development that follows. So thanks for such a fantastic Hodgkin lymphoma series.
Oh, thank you so much. Such a pleasure.
And to Anna in the background.
Yes.
Keeping
absolutely.
women in lymphoma looking so well organized. Thank you so much indeed. And everyone, before you leave, there's also just some lovely comments on the chat that you might all want to have a look at before you check out. And now I'm racing back to my MDT. Bye, folks.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank
You know, I'll
you.
just comment, there was
Bye-bye.
a comment here. We only talk about our mentors, but a circle of friends and peers is also an amazing support system. And I think case in point
Oh.
here, you know, I think through all these women, you know, it's a personal connection, and the support that I get and we all get, I think really makes this field special.
True.
I agree. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Enjoyed it,
So
Ranjana.
maybe-
Yeah, thanks, Anne, for putting this whole thing
Oh,
together.
that was just